How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation. In today's video, I've got 4 topics to cover. The first one is that the PS5 Pro is going to feel 100% more powerful than the current PS5. The second news story is that it is time for a PS5 price cut. Third on the list, we're going to talk about how one of my favorite old Sony studios just got shut down, which is a huge bummer. And fourth, we got the requirements for God of War Ragnarok on PC, and it's keeping up a trend of looking like it's going to be a great port. All right, let's jump into this first news story here, which is all about the PS5 Pro. I know that people want to live in a state of denial and say that the PS5 Pro is not happening because, you couldn't get a PS5 for 2 years when it was first available. Of course, once you finally got one, Sony stopped releasing games for it, and now it looks like they're holding them back for the launch of the PS5 Pro. I understand why people don't want the PS5 Pro to be real, but it's real. It's coming. Digital Foundry's talking about it. Moore's Law is Dead is talking about it. Insider Gaming's talking about it. There are even accounts on Twitter where people know developers who actually have the console, and they're just begging Sony to announce a showcase where they can finally reveal this thing because it's been leaking for over a year. It's been real for over a year. The 30th anniversary of PlayStation is this year. They're expected to announce a special edition console that I'm going to try and get. Let's get this console announced so we can stop playing in this weird realm where we don't know if it exists, but we totally know it exists. Anyway, one of the people I just mentioned, Moore's Law is Dead. He is like the go-to source for any hardware leaks for really any console, whether it's the Xbox handheld, the PlayStation Portal, this handheld that Sony's working on, or of course the PS5 Pro. On his podcast, he basically broke down what it's going to feel like to actually have a PS5 Pro versus what it's going to feel like playing a game on the current PS5. So the real bread and butter that's coming along with the PS5 Pro is PSSR. It's like PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution. Basically what that is Sony's homegrown competitor to something like DLSS or FSR 3.0. Now those are PC things. I know all of you only play on console, you don't have PCs. Basically, all you need to know about what PSSR does is that it's going to upscale your games from resolutions like 1080p all the way up to 4K, but because of the horsepower of the PS5 Pro, the games are going to be internally running probably around 1440p and then upscale to 4K. Now in the past on the PS4 Pro, Sony used checkerboard rendering, which was like kind of similar, where it would run at a lower resolution. It would basically checkerboard out your screen and then use the edges to kind of upscale the game to make it look better. And back then that was a great solution, right? Like DLSS was in its early stages. FSR I don't even think was a thing, but in the years since then, those two technologies, DLSS and FSR, have totally run laps around checkerboard rendering. And now if you're playing a game on PC, you're basically going to use DLSS because it looks better than anti-aliasing. Like if you just run the game natively, like if you have a powerful enough PC like I do to run a game at 4K, in most cases it will look worse if you use old school anti-aliasing and run it at 4K than if you run it internally at like 1080p or 1440p and then upscale it with DLSS. Like that technology is that good. So PSSR, if it's on par with these two other technologies, like it really seems like it's going to be, is going to be awesome, because when you use these technologies to upscale your games, what it allows you to do is run them at 60 frames per second. Another detail they revealed is that games that already run well on the PS5, like Jedi Survivor, that one's on the mind because of course it's coming to PS4 later this year. That game runs at 60 FPS now, but it uses FSR2, so the upscaling looks like crap. If you combine PSSR with the fact that it already runs at 60 FPS, not only is the internal resolution going to be higher, which is great, but the upscaling is going to be awesome, and they'll be able to implement the ray tracing features that came with the game when you were using the quality mode, which basically ran the game at the highest graphic settings that the PS5 could handle. So not only are you going to get higher frame rates, your games are going to look better, and ray tracing will finally be a thing on consoles, which is crazy because I've mentioned this before. I worked for Austin Evans before, which means I got access to computers that had good graphics cards. I've been around since ray tracing was announced on PC in the 20 series, I'm pretty sure. And it was always just like this fever dream thing, right? Like when you would get a 2080 or 2080 Super or a 3070, 3080, 3090, 4080, 4090, all of these cards have ray tracing capabilities. But if you turned on ray tracing, even when you were using DLSS, most times you would not even be able to hold a rock solid 60 frames per second. So you're basically limited to playing games at 30 FPS if if you're someone who prefers a consistent frame rate like I do. So I've never really used ray tracing. I never really cared about it, even though all my computers that I've had for like the last 5 years have been able to do it. I just completely ignored the feature. But then I saw the light with Spider-Man 2. Because if you didn't know, Spider-Man 2 uses ray tracing in all of its performance settings. So if you're in performance mode, the 60 FPS mode, you're going to see ray tracing. If you're in the quality mode, you're going to see ray tracing, and it looks really good. You get good reflections when you're walking around the city. Water puddles will reflect things better. It'll look more realistic. Like the sunsets in that game look phenomenal, and I really understood why people enjoy ray tracing on beefed up desktop PCs, because mine is a laptop. That's why I've always ignored ray tracing, because a laptop 4090 is not on par with like a desktop 4090. It's more like a desktop 4080 or 4070 Super. So just from a raw hardware perspective, that gets me really excited for the PS5 Pro, because something I've come to appreciate when it comes to consoles versus PC gaming over the past couple of years especially is I don't want to mess with settings anymore. I don't want to figure out what performance profile on my PC is going to allow a game to run at 60 FPS. I don't want to mess with stuttering or shader compilation. I just don't want to do tech support for games I'm spending $70 on anymore. And the PS5 is a big power jump over the PS4, so it's been a great revolution for me to kind of be able to just sit down, boot up games like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and get great performance and great graphics right out of the gate and not have to mess with settings or anything. I turn on my PS5 with the controller, my TV automatically turns on, my speakers are all set up, I don't have to switch between my headphones and my PlayStation Link adapter and my soundbar and everything like that. Everything just works. And at the end of the workday, after I've made videos, after I've done all my housework and everything like that, all I want to do is sit down and play video games. So if I'm going to get a noticeable power increase out of the PS5 Pro that brings it even closer to my gaming laptop that runs laps around the PS5's power, that's just a net win overall, and it gets me really excited. So yeah, all we can really do now is just sit back and wait. It seems like Sony's gearing up to do a showcase in September. If you look at the history of showcases, in the years where they did one in September, they didn't do one in May, and in the years they didn't do one in May or June. Obviously plans can change, but it's also very obvious that they're cooking up a lot of games right now that need to be announced, so we are long overdue for a showcase. Anyway, that brings us to the second news story here, which is a cry to Sony to just drop the price of the PlayStation 5. So we kind of touched on this in the last video, but if you didn't hear, PlayStation 5 sales, while they're doing well, it's 7% ahead of the PS4. If you line up the timelines, the sales are falling pretty quickly. So last year, they sold around 3.3 million PS5s in this same time period, so the first quarter. And this year, which the first quarter just ended in, they ended up selling around 2.8 million PS5s, which is a pretty big drop off. Now, the reasoning for that is very clear. First of all, the PS5 is extremely expensive, right? Like they released it at $500, it stayed at $500. They've even increased the price of the console around the world. And when you increase the price instead of dropping it, that's not going to get people to go out and buy your console. The second big thing that's hurting the PS5 is that, again, like I was just talking about, there's no next gen games. There are games coming out pretty much every month, but nothing that really screams Sony first party, you need to play this game. We've had stuff like Stellar Blade, we've had stuff like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but we're waiting on the big games from Santa Monica Studio, Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, and everyone else. And once those games start coming, obviously there's going to be an increase in PS5 sales, but I still think the PS5 needs a bit of a price drop. Like if you look at every generation that's happened before the PS5, Sony, when they released the slim model, always dropped the price. I remember my brother, he was stuck on the Xbox 360 for pretty much the beginning of that generation. But when the PS4 Slim came out and it came with a bigger hard drive and a bundled game, and there was a Black Friday deal where you could get it for I think $249.99, he had enough money to buy it, and he wasn't the only one who did. Basically at that point in time, it went from a few of my friends who bought a PS4 on launch day to all of my friends having one because the price was right. And with the PS5 being out for almost 4 years now, I'd say we're well past the point where everyone who is going to buy a PS5 at $500 or $450, which is what the digital model costs of the PS5 Slim, they've all bought the console. Basically, the user base of people who are going to buy a PS5 at full price is completely tapped out. And when Sony does drop the price like they just did last week, you see the thing shoot up in sales on Amazon and reach that #1 spot, to the point where the PS5 Slim was actively selling out on pretty much every storefront that did the price drop. So if I'm Sony and I'm looking at that situation, I'm saying, hey, maybe I should just make the de facto facto price of the PlayStation 5, $400 for the digital model, bring it back to where it was before we released the Slim, and make the disc model $450. $50 obviously doesn't seem like that big of a drop, but there are a lot of games that have dropped in price that came out in the beginning of the generation, so you could use that $50 to put it towards a couple games that are like $20 or $30. You could also put it towards a year of PS Plus. You could put it towards a new game and only have to pay $20 to get to the actual asking price of it. So when you drop the price just by $50, it obviously gets people more excited to play the PS5 and go out and purchase it. But if they really want to get people excited to go out and buy this machine, I would say drop it by $100. Get the disc model down to $450, get the digital model down to $350. I think at $350, you're going to see people buying it because that's been the de facto price of the Xbox Series S. And even though that console is basically just an upgraded slightly Xbox One, that's the console that's selling best for Xbox. I feel like that $350 price range is where people don't only feel comfortable buying a console, but they feel like they're stupid not to. And even if they lose money on the console, because as we've heard, the reason why the price hasn't dropped dramatically yet is because components are still expensive from the supply chain issues that happened during 2020, you're going to make it back on games. That's how the system has worked in every other generation. They would take a loss on the console and then they would make it back by selling games, because if they sell a first party game, they get 100% of the profit. If they sell a third party game, they get 30% of the profit. So either way, no matter what they sell on the PlayStation Store, they're making money. And when you get people who go out and buy a console, especially at a heavily discounted price, they're going to turn around and take that extra $100 and spend it on games, which will make back the amount of money that you lose by selling the console at a loss. So yeah, I think we're well past the point where it's justifiable to do a price drop on the PS5. Hopefully when the PS5 Pro is announced, it's not a $600 machine. Hopefully it takes the $500 slot from the PS5 and they drop the PS5 and PS5 digital model down by $100 each. I think that would be the smartest thing to do for Sony. Anyway, that brings us to the third topic of this video, which is one of my favorite Sony studios has just shut down, and that studio is Ready at Dawn. If you don't know who Ready at Dawn is, it's probably because you're younger, but when I was growing up, these guys had the market cornered in PSP games based on Sony's best first party games. They had the two God of War games, God of War Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta, which were two amazing God of War games. Like if you told me Santa Monica Studio made them, I'd 100% believe you. They had Daxter, which was an awesome game that was a new story in the map from Jak 2. That was one of the first PSP games my brother got and I borrowed it from him. I ended up beating it in like 2 nights because I had so much fun playing it. Then they did their first console game on the PlayStation 4, The Order 1886, which is super underrated. My friend Jake Baldino did a video on his personal channel, I think a little over a year ago, where he did a retrospective on it. I highly recommend checking it out because that game was so ahead of its time. And then because The Order 1886 didn't sell well, they basically got put in a situation where they had to sell their studio. Sony didn't want to buy them because that game didn't sell well. So Facebook ended up picking them up because they started working on VR games and they made some really cool ones, and they made some more cool VR games, but they just weren't good enough. They didn't sell well enough. So now, because VR is kind of flatlining, Facebook has shut them down. I really wish that Sony looked at The Order 1886 in a different light back when that game came out, because it was awesome. It was so cool being the Knights of the Round Table in this like early industrial age setting, fighting werewolves and everything like that. Yeah, it was short. It was like 5 hours long. And yeah, there wasn't enough combat scenarios in it, but the shooting felt good. And graphically speaking, it was far ahead of its time. You can compare that game's graphics to games that come out today, and that game looks and runs a lot better than games do now. So I think Sony should have definitely ponied up the money to buy them. And honestly, I feel like if that game had come out during the PS5 generation, Sony would have definitely bought them with all the industry consolidation that's going on now. But it just wasn't in the cards at the time, and unfortunately, it has resulted in one of the greatest Sony PSP studios being shut down, which really sucks. Anyway, that brings us to the fourth news story here on the list, which is that PC specs have been released for God of War Ragnarok, and once again, it looks like we're getting another banger port from Sony. So to run this game at the minimum spec, which is 1080p 30 FPS at low settings, you're only going to need a 1660 graphics card, which is pretty much the cheapest graphics card out there. I'm pretty sure most of the people on PC are using that card, so you'll be able to play this game at basically PS4 settings. For the recommended spec, which is 1080p 60 FPS medium settings, so right at about what the PS5 runs it at internally before upscaling, you're only going to need a 2070 Super, which is a 2 generations old card now. So if you want to get a used card to run this game, you're going to be just fine. And then there's a generational jump jump for the high settings, which is where I want to sit, which is 1440p, 60 FPS. High settings, you're going to need a 3070, so I'll be just fine with my 4090. Then there's a bigger jump for performance, which is 4K at high settings, 60 FPS. You're going to need a 3080 Ti, which, you know, on paper is about where I sit, so I might be able to squeeze that out. And then finally, to get away with the ultra spec, I might be just fine because this game only requires a 4070 and the ultra spec is 4K, 60 FPS, ultra settings. So yeah, it doesn't look like you're going to need much to be able to run this game pretty much maxed out. And those last two settings are basically higher than what you get out of the PS5. And I'm kind of shocked at how like minimal the requirements are. I mean, Sony so far has done really good PC ports, except for The Last of Us Part 1. That one was a joke. So yeah, I think if you have a gaming PC pretty much across the board, you're going to be able to run this game. I think I'm going to skip this PC release, even though God of War Ragnarok is one of my favorite games of all time. And so far, I think the best Sony game this generation by like a wide margin. I 100%ed this game and it's still fresh in my mind. So even though I absolutely love it, there's a lot of new stuff coming out later this year where I don't really feel like double dipping. I really wish Sony would just release their PC launcher so I could just take advantage of the games I already own digitally on my PC and not have to buy them twice, because if that was the case, I would 100% be playing this day one. But yeah, let me know if you're going to be playing God of War Ragnarok down in the comments below. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching and shape on.